Major Sarah Chen adjusted her flight helmet as she walked across the scorching tarmac at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, but the heat outside was nothing compared to the tension she felt in her chest. Today would either make or break her reputation as an A-10 Warthog pilot. The mission briefing had been unlike any other she'd received in her 8 years of military service. A team of Navy SEALs was pinned down in a narrow valley, surrounded by Taliban fighters who had the high ground. The enemy had positioned themselves cleverly in caves and rocky outcroppings that made traditional air support nearly impossible. Every pilot who had attempted to help the SEALs had been forced to abort their runs due to the extreme terrain and the risk of hitting friendly forces. Chen remembered the skeptical looks from the SEAL team leader during the briefing. Commander Jake Morrison had been polite but direct when he questioned whether she understood the complexity of the situation. His weathered face showed years of combat experience, and his eyes held the kind of doubt that came from seeing too many missions go wrong. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Morrison had said, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility for his men's lives. "We've had some of the best pilots in the Air Force try to get us close air support in that valley. The terrain is unforgiving and the margin for error is zero. One mistake and you could take out our entire team." The other pilots in the room had nodded in agreement. They'd all heard the stories about the valley that the locals called the Devil's Throat. It was a winding canyon with walls that rose nearly vertical for hundreds of feet. The Taliban had learned to use it as a fortress, knowing that aircraft couldn't get low enough to be effective without risking a crash into the rocky walls. Chen had studied the satellite images for hours, tracing the path through the valley with her finger. She'd calculated angles, wind patterns, and approach vectors until her eyes burned from staring at the computer screen. What others saw as impossible, she saw as a puzzle that just needed the right solution. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed Warthog by pilots for its ungainly appearance, was designed for exactly this kind of close air support mission. The aircraft was built around its massive 30mm Ju-8 cannon, capable of destroying enemy positions with surgical precision. More importantly, it was designed to fly low and slow, absorbing damage that would bring down other aircraft. As Chen approached her aircraft, she ran her hand along the titanium armor that protected the cockpit. The A-10 might not be the fastest or prettiest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, but it was tough as nails and perfect for supporting troops on the ground. She'd trained for years to master the art of flying in hostile territory, threading the needle between enemy fire and friendly forces. The ground crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, greeted her with a mixture of concern and admiration. He'd worked with Chen on dozens of missions and had never seen her back down from a challenge. But even he seemed worried about this one. "Major, I've checked every system twice," Martinez reported, his voice betraying his nervousness. "She's ready to fly, but that valley..." "I've seen the footage from the reconnaissance drones. It's like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster." Chen smiled and placed a reassuring hand on the sergeant's shoulder. She understood his concern, but she also knew that somewhere in that valley, American warriors were counting on her to find a way to help them. The SEALs had been trapped for over 6 hours, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. As she completed her pre-flight inspection, Chen's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her father the night before. Colonel David Chen, himself a veteran pilot, had always taught her that being underestimated could be an advantage. "Let them doubt you, Sarah," he'd said during their video call. "Then show them what you're made of." The doubt wasn't just about her abilities as a pilot, though that was certainly part of it. In a male-dominated field like military aviation, Chen had faced skepticism throughout her career. She'd been the only woman in her pilot training class, the only female A-10 pilot in her first squadron, and now she was being asked to attempt something that experienced male pilots had deemed impossible. But Chen had learned long ago that proving herself meant more than just talking about her capabilities. It meant strapping herself into the cockpit and delivering results when everything was on the line. The SEALs below didn't care about her gender or the politics of military aviation. They cared about whether she could keep them alive. As she climbed into the cockpit of her A-10, Chen felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before every combat mission. The aircraft systems hummed to life around her, each gauge and indicator confirming that her Warthog was ready for battle. She adjusted her seat, checked her weapon systems one final time, and requested permission for takeoff. The tower cleared her for departure, and Chen felt the powerful engines push her down the runway. As the wheels left the ground and Afghanistan spread out below her, she knew that the next hour would determine not just the fate of the trapped SEALs, but also whether the military would finally recognize that sometimes the impossible just required a different approach. 20 minutes into her flight, Major Chen could see the jagged peaks that marked the entrance to what the locals called the Devil's Throat. From her altitude of 15,000 feet, the valley looked like a thin scar carved into the mountainside by some angry god. She could understand why previous pilots had turned back before even attempting to enter the canyon. Her radio crackled to life with the voice of Commander Morrison, the SEAL team leader on the ground. His words were measured, but she could hear the tension underneath. Hawkeye 7-7, this is Bravo 6. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Enemy fighters are dug in approximately 200 meters north of our position, using the cave systems for cover. Chen studied her tactical display, correlating Morrison's position with the terrain mapping she'd memorized during her mission planning. The SEALs were trapped on a narrow ledge about halfway up the eastern wall of the canyon, with Taliban fighters both above and below them. Any air support would have to come from an angle that seemed mathematically impossible. Bravo 6, Hawkeye 7-7, Chen responded, her voice calm despite the complexity of the situation. I have your position marked. Beginning my descent now. Stand by for gun runs. What Chen didn't tell Morrison was that she was about to attempt something that violated every standard operating procedure for close air support missions. Traditional doctrine called for maintaining safe altitudes and approach angles that minimized risk to the aircraft. But traditional doctrine hadn't been written for terrain like this. She pushed the nose of her A-10 down and began a steep descent toward the valley mouth. The rocky walls seemed to grow larger by the second, rising up on either side like the jaws of some massive beast. At 8,000 feet, she was still too high to be effective. At 5,000 feet, she could see the muzzle flashes from enemy weapons, but the angle was still wrong. The first challenge came sooner than expected. As Chen approached the valley entrance, her radar warning receiver lit up like a Christmas tree. The Taliban had learned to position surface-to-air missiles at the mouth of the canyon, creating a kill zone that had forced previous aircraft to abort their approaches. Chen had anticipated this. Instead of approaching the valley head-on, she rolled her A-10 into a sharp banking turn that took her around the eastern ridge. The maneuver was risky, flying only a few hundred feet above the jagged peaks, but it allowed her to avoid the missile threat while positioning herself for an unexpected approach angle. As she came around the ridge, the full scope of the SEALs' predicament became clear. The Taliban had indeed positioned themselves brilliantly, using the natural rock formations to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. Chen could see the small cluster of American forces pinned down on their ledge, their position marked by the distinctive flash of their weapons as they returned fire. But she could also see something that the previous pilots had missed. There was a narrow corridor along the western wall of the canyon, a space barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, that would allow her to approach the enemy positions from an angle they hadn't anticipated. The approach would require flying inverted, upside down, to maintain the proper angle for her cannon while navigating the narrow space between the canyon wall and the enemy positions. It was a maneuver that existed more in theory than in practice, something that pilots discussed in bars but rarely attempted in combat. Chen rolled her A-10 inverted and began her descent into the canyon. The world turned upside down around her as she threaded the needle between the rocky walls. Her altimeter spun downward, 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet. The margin for error was measured in yards now, not miles. Flying inverted in such confined space required constant micro-adjustments to her control surfaces. The slightest overcorrection would send her aircraft into the canyon wall. Chen's hands moved with practiced precision on the stick and throttles, making tiny inputs to keep her warthog centered in the narrow corridor. At 2,500 feet above the valley floor, she could see individual enemy fighters scrambling to reposition their weapons. They had been expecting air support to come from above or from the canyon mouth, not from this impossible angle along the western wall. Chen lined up her first target, a group of Taliban fighters who had positioned themselves behind a large boulder formation. They were so focused on the SEALs below that they hadn't noticed the approaching A-10 until it was too late to react effectively. The 30mm cannon erupted to life, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds into the enemy position. Flying inverted made the targeting more complex, requiring Chen to compensate for the reversed controls while maintaining her precise flight path through the narrow canyon. Her first gun run was devastatingly effective. The enemy position simply disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, but Chen knew she was just getting started. The Taliban had multiple positions throughout the canyon, and each one would require a different approach angle to neutralize effectively. As she pulled out of her first attack run, climbing along the eastern wall to set up for her next pass, Chen's radio exploded with chatter from the SEALs below. For the first time in hours, Morrison's voice carried something other than grim determination. "Hawkeye 7-7, that was outstanding. How the hell did you get that angle? The enemy fighters are scrambling. Looks like you caught them completely off guard." Chen smiled grimly as she set up for her second run. She was just warming up, and the hardest part was still ahead. The Taliban would adapt quickly to her tactics, and she would need to find new ways to support the trapped SEALs while navigating terrain that seemed determined to kill her. Chen banked her A-10 hard to the right, using the canyon's eastern wall to mask her approach for the second gun run. Below her, she could see the Taliban fighters scrambling to reposition their weapons. They had realized that the attack was coming from an impossible angle, and they were adapting faster than she had hoped. The second target was more challenging than the first. A group of enemy fighters had taken position in a series of connected caves about 50 meters above the trapped SEALs. The caves provided excellent protection from conventional airstrikes, but they also created a tactical problem that made Chen's jaw clench with concentration. To hit the cave positions effectively, she would need to fly even lower, threading her aircraft through a space that was barely wide enough for her wingspan. Worse, the angle required for the gun run would put her directly in the line of fire from other enemy positions scattered throughout the canyon. Chen rolled inverted again and began her descent, this time approaching from the northwestern corner of the canyon. The rocky walls seemed to close in around her aircraft as she descended below 1,000 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, she could see individual rocks and boulders on the canyon walls, some so close that her wingtips seemed to barely clear them. Her radar warning receiver was screaming constantly now. The Taliban had managed to move several shoulder-fired missiles into position, and the confined space of the canyon meant she had very little room to maneuver if they launched. Chen pushed the warnings to the back of her mind and focused on the immediate task of keeping her aircraft from becoming a smoking crater on the canyon floor. The cave opening came into view, a dark slash in the rocky wall where muzzle flashes indicated ongoing enemy fire directed at the SEALs below. Chen had to time her gun run perfectly, waiting until she was close enough for maximum effectiveness while leaving herself enough room to pull out of the dive without hitting the opposite canyon wall. At 800 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon thundered to life, its distinctive sound echoing off the canyon walls like rolling thunder. The 30mm rounds impacted the cave entrance with devastating effect, sending chunks of rock cascading down the canyon wall and silencing the enemy fire from that position. But Chen's celebration was short-lived. As she pulled out of her dive, climbing steeply to avoid the canyon floor, her aircraft shuddered from multiple impacts. Red warning lights illuminated her cockpit as she realized that small arms fire from other enemy positions had found its mark. "Hawkeye 7-7, you're trailing smoke," Morrison's voice crackled through her headset, concern evident in his tone. "Are you hit?" Chen quickly scanned her instruments, assessing the damage while maintaining her climb out of the canyon. Her hydraulic pressure was dropping, and she had lost some control authority in her right aileron. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment. But even the Warthog had its limits. "Bravo 6. I've taken some hits, but the bird is still flying," Chen reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, continuing the mission. What Chen didn't tell Morrison was that her aircraft was more seriously damaged than she wanted to admit. The hydraulic system was compromised, making her control inputs less responsive. More concerning, she could see fuel streaming from her left wing tank, creating a visible trail in the air behind her. But looking down at the canyon, she could see that her efforts were working. The SEALs had been able to move from their original position, taking advantage of the confusion among the Taliban fighters to advance toward a more defensible location. However, there were still several enemy positions that threatened to pin them down again if she couldn't neutralize them. Chen set up for her third gun run, this time targeting a machine gun position that had been established on a narrow ledge overlooking the SEAL's new position. The shot would be the most difficult yet, requiring her to approach from an angle that would take her aircraft through the narrowest part of the canyon, while dealing with reduced control authority from her battle damage as she rolled inverted and began her approach. Chen could feel her aircraft responding sluggishly to her control inputs. The damaged hydraulic system meant she had to apply more force to achieve the same maneuvers, and the fuel leak was affecting her aircraft's balance. She compensated by adjusting her approach speed and using her trim tabs to maintain the precise flight path required for the gun run. The machine gun position came into view, its crew desperately trying to traverse their weapon to engage her aircraft. Chen could see the individual fighters clearly now, close enough to observe their frantic movements as they realized the danger approaching from their blind spot. She squeezed the trigger again, and the cannon responded with its characteristic roar. The depleted uranium rounds impacted the rocky ledge with devastating precision, eliminating the machine gun position and sending debris cascading into the canyon below. As she climbed out of the canyon for the third time, Chen's fuel warning light illuminated. The leak in her wing tank was worse than she had initially assessed, and she was losing fuel at a rate that would limit her ability to continue the mission. She had perhaps 2 more gun runs before she would be forced to return to base. But looking down at the tactical situation, she could see that her efforts were having the desired effect. The Taliban fighters were no longer operating with the confidence they had shown at the beginning of the engagement. Several positions had been abandoned, and the remaining fighters seemed more focused on their own survival than on maintaining their attack on the trapped SEALs. Morrison's voice came through her headset again, this time with something approaching amazement. Hawkeye 7-7, I don't know how you're doing what you're doing, but you've got these guys completely rattled. We've been able to advance 50 meters and establish a better defensive position. Chen smiled grimly as she set up for what she knew would be one of her final gun runs. Her aircraft was wounded, she was running low on fuel, and the enemy was beginning to adapt to her tactics. But she had come too far to stop now, and the SEALs below were depending on her to finish what she had started. Chen circled high above the canyon, assessing the remaining enemy positions while her damaged A-10 struggled to maintain altitude. The fuel leak had worsened, leaving a visible trail of vapor that any enemy fighter with a surface-to-air missile could easily track. Her hydraulic pressure continued to drop, and she estimated she had perhaps 10 more minutes of flight time before she would be forced to return to base. Commander Morrison's voice cut through the static on her radio, and for the first time since the engagement began, she could hear genuine hope in his tone. Hawkeye 7-7, you've cleared most of the positions, but we've got one more problem. There's a sniper team positioned on the northern ridge that's got us pinned down. Every time we try to move toward the extraction point, they light us up. Chen studied her tactical display, locating the position Morrison was describing. The sniper team had chosen their location brilliantly, positioned on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent fields of fire while being virtually impossible to approach from the ground. Previous airstrikes had failed to neutralize the position because the traditional approach angles couldn't achieve the precision required without risking the lives of the nearby SEALs. The challenge was even more complex than her previous gun runs. The sniper position was located on a narrow ledge barely wider than a car, surrounded by rocky formations that would make a conventional approach impossible. To hit the target effectively, she would need to approach from below, flying up through the canyon in a nearly vertical climb while maintaining the precision necessary to eliminate the threat without hitting friendly forces. Chen had never attempted such a maneuver in combat, and she wasn't sure her damaged aircraft could handle the stress of a near-vertical gun run. The reduced hydraulic pressure meant her control surfaces were less responsive, and the fuel leak was affecting her aircraft's weight distribution. Any mistake would likely result in her A-10 slamming into the canyon wall or spinning out of control. But looking at her tactical display, she could see that the SEALs were trapped less than 200 meters from their planned extraction point. A helicopter was already en route, but it couldn't land safely with the sniper team still in position. Morrison and his men had survived this long because of their skill and determination, but they needed her to eliminate this final threat. Chen rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, approaching the canyon from the south where the walls were slightly wider. Her plan was to enter the canyon at high speed, then pull into a nearly vertical climb that would bring her gun within range of the sniper position. The maneuver would require split-second timing and perfect aircraft control, neither of which was guaranteed given her battle damage. As she descended into the canyon for what she knew would be her final gun run, Chen could feel her aircraft protesting the demands she was placing on it. The control stick felt heavy in her hands, requiring constant pressure to maintain her desired flight path. The fuel warning alarm had been sounding for several minutes, and she estimated she had perhaps 5 minutes of flight time remaining. At 500 feet above the canyon floor, Chen pulled back hard on the stick, transitioning from her high-speed descent into a nearly vertical climb. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat as her A-10 clawed for altitude, its engine straining to maintain airspeed in the thin mountain air. The sniper position came into view ahead and slightly above her, a small dark shape against the rocky canyon wall. Chen could see the enemy fighters clearly now, 2 men who were frantically trying to reposition their rifle to engage her aircraft. They had probably never seen an A-10 approach from such an angle, and their confusion was evident in their panicked movements. Chen lined up her shot, compensating for her aircraft's reduced control authority and the unusual angle of attack. The 30mm cannon was designed for ground targets, but using it in a nearly vertical climb required her to account for gravity's effect on the trajectory of her rounds. She had perhaps 2 seconds to get the shot right before her climb would stall and send her aircraft tumbling back toward the canyon floor. She squeezed the trigger, and the Gauss cannon roared to life one final time. The depleted uranium rounds streaked upward toward the sniper position, their distinctive orange tracers marking their path through the thin mountain air. Chen watched with satisfaction as the rounds found their target, eliminating the sniper team in a brief flash of dust and debris. But her celebration was short-lived. As she reached the top of her vertical climb, her aircraft began to shudder violently. The combination of battle damage, fuel starvation, and the extreme maneuver had pushed her A-10 beyond its limits. Her engine began to surge irregularly, and she could feel her aircraft starting to lose power. Chen quickly rolled inverted and dove back toward the canyon floor, using gravity to maintain her airspeed as her engine continued to lose power. Her fuel gauges were reading empty, and she knew she had perhaps minutes before her aircraft would be forced to make an emergency landing in hostile territory. Bravo 6. Hawkeye 7-7, she called over the radio, her voice calm despite the desperate situation developing in her cockpit. Target neutralized. You are clear to move to the extraction point. I'm declaring an emergency and heading for base. Morrison's response was immediate and heartfelt. Hawkeye 7-7, I don't know how to thank you. You just saved 8 American lives with flying that I didn't think was possible. Good luck getting home. As Chen climbed slowly out of the canyon, nursing her damaged aircraft toward the relative safety of higher altitude, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The mission had been successful. The SEALs were safe, and she had proven that sometimes the impossible just required a different approach. But her celebration was premature. As she cleared the canyon walls, her engine finally gave up completely, windmilling to a stop as her fuel tanks ran dry. Major Sarah Chen was now gliding a 30,000-pound aircraft over some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan, with no power and very few options for survival. Major Chen's hands moved with practiced efficiency as her powerless A-10 glided silently through the thin mountain air. Without engine power, she had perhaps 8 minutes of flight time before she would be forced to attempt a landing in terrain that offered very few suitable options. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but no amount of simulation could replicate the stark reality of flying a dead aircraft over hostile territory. Her first priority was to establish contact with the rescue coordination center and transmit her position before she was forced to land. Chen switched to the emergency frequency and began broadcasting her situation, hoping that someone was listening who could organize a rescue effort. Mayday. Mayday, this is Hawkeye 7-7 declaring an emergency. Engine failure, gliding at Angels 12, approximately 30 miles northeast of Bagram. Fuel exhausted, attempting emergency landing. The response came immediately from the Air Traffic Control Center at Bagram Airfield. Hawkeye 7-7, this is Bagram Tower. We copy your emergency. Search and rescue is being notified. What is your intended landing area? Chen studied the terrain below her, looking for anything that resembled a suitable landing spot. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks covered with snow and their valleys filled with rocks and ravines that would destroy her aircraft on impact. She needed to find a relatively flat area with enough length to accommodate her landing roll, and it needed to be accessible to rescue teams. About 5 miles ahead, she spotted what appeared to be a dried riverbed that ran roughly east-west through a narrow valley. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option she could see within her gliding range. The surface looked relatively smooth, and the valley was wide enough that she wouldn't have to worry about hitting the canyon walls during her approach. Bagram Tower, Hawkeye 77. I have a possible landing site. A dried riverbed in a valley approximately 25 miles northeast of base. Transmitting coordinates now. Chen programmed her GPS coordinates into her emergency locator beacon and activated the device. The beacon would broadcast her position continuously, allowing rescue teams to find her even if she was unable to communicate after landing. She also began destroying any classified materials in her cockpit, following standard operating procedures for emergency landings in hostile territory. As she continued her glide toward the riverbed, Chen's mind raced through the emergency landing checklist she had memorized years ago. She needed to configure her aircraft for the slowest possible landing speed, while maintaining enough control authority to execute a safe touchdown. The A-10's design characteristics that made it excellent for close air support also made it relatively forgiving for emergency landings. But she was still attempting something that few pilots had ever survived. At 5,000 feet above the valley floor, Chen began her approach to the dried riverbed. She could see now that the surface was rougher than it had appeared from higher altitude, with scattered rocks and what appeared to be several deep ruts carved by previous water flow. She would have only one chance to get the landing right, as there was no possibility of executing a go-around without engine power. Chen extended her landing gear and flaps, trading altitude for the slower airspeed she would need for touchdown. Her approach speed was still higher than ideal for the rough terrain she was facing, but she had no choice except to work with the energy she had available. The valley walls seemed to close in around her as she descended toward the riverbed. At 500 feet above the ground, she could see individual rocks and obstacles scattered across her intended landing area. She picked the smoothest section she could identify and committed to her approach, knowing that any attempt to change her landing point now would likely result in a crash. At 100 feet, Chen could see that her chosen landing spot included several large boulders that she would need to avoid during her touchdown and rollout. She adjusted her aim point slightly to the left, hoping to thread the needle between the obstacles while maintaining enough speed to keep her aircraft controllable. The A-10's main landing gear touched down hard on the rocky surface, sending vibrations through the aircraft that Chen could feel in her bones. She immediately applied maximum braking, while using her rudder pedals to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the riverbed. Rocks and debris flew up around her cockpit as her aircraft bounced and skidded across the uneven surface. For several terrifying seconds, it seemed as if her A-10 might flip over or slide sideways into one of the large boulders. Chen fought to maintain control, using every technique she had learned during her emergency procedures training to keep her aircraft upright and moving in the right direction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 30 seconds, her A-10 came to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. Chen sat in her cockpit for a moment, hardly believing that she had survived the landing. Her aircraft was battered and would never fly again. But she was alive and uninjured in what could generously be described as the middle of nowhere. She quickly shut down all remaining aircraft systems and prepared to egress from her cockpit. The valley was quiet for now, but she knew that the sound of her landing would have been heard for miles in the thin mountain air. If there were enemy forces in the area, they would be converging on her position soon. Chen gathered her survival kit and her weapon, then climbed out of her battered A-10 onto the rocky surface of the riverbed. The silence was almost overwhelming after hours of engine noise and radio chatter. She was alone in the mountains of Afghanistan, but she was alive, and somewhere above her she knew that people were already working to bring her home. Major Chen crouched behind a large boulder about 50 meters from her crashed A-10, scanning the ridgelines around the valley for any signs of enemy movement. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, and she knew that darkness would bring both opportunities and dangers. Her survival training had taught her that the first few hours after an emergency landing were critical, as this was when rescue forces would be most active, but also when enemy fighters would be most likely to investigate the crash site. Her emergency radio crackled to life with a transmission from the Rescue Coordination Center. Hawkeye 7-7, this is Pedro 2-4. We have your position and are en route. Estimated time to your location is 45 minutes. What is your status? Chen keyed her radio carefully, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention. Pedro 2-4, Hawkeye 7-7. I am uninjured and mobile. Landing site is a dried riverbed in a narrow valley. No enemy contact at this time, but the area is not secure. The rescue helicopter pilot's response was professional, but reassuring. Copy, Hawkeye 7-7. We're bringing a full team and we'll have Apache gunship escort. Find a good hiding spot and stay low until we arrive. Chen had already identified her hiding position during her initial reconnaissance of the area. A cluster of large rocks about 200 meters up the eastern slope of the valley would provide excellent concealment, while giving her a good view of the approaches to the crash site. The position was also far enough from her aircraft that she could avoid capture, even if enemy forces reached the A-10 before the rescue team arrived. She carefully made her way up the rocky slope, moving from cover to cover and pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate enemy movement. The mountain air was thin at this altitude, and the physical exertion of climbing while carrying her survival gear and weapon left her breathing hard despite her excellent physical condition. Reaching her chosen hiding position, Chen settled in behind the rocks and established a watch routine that would allow her to monitor all the approaches to the valley while conserving her energy for the rescue operation. She also took the opportunity to inventory her survival equipment and assess her situation more thoroughly. Her survival kit included water purification tablets, high-energy food bars, a first aid kit, signaling devices, and a sleeping bag rated for the cold mountain nights. Her sidearm was loaded with 2 full magazines, giving her limited defensive capability if she encountered enemy forces before the rescue team arrived. As the sun continued to sink toward the horizon, Chen began to hear the distant sound of engines echoing off the valley walls. The sound was coming from the north and it was getting closer. She raised her binoculars and scanned the northern approach to the valley, looking for the source of the noise. What she saw made her blood run cold. A convoy of 3 pickup trucks was making its way down a rough trail that led into the valley from the north. Even at a distance, she could see that the vehicles were loaded with armed men, and they were heading directly toward her crash site. Chen immediately grabbed her radio and transmitted a warning to the rescue team. Pedro 2-4, Hawkeye 7-7. I have visual on enemy forces approaching the crash site from the north. 3 vehicles with approximately 12 to 15 personnel. They will reach the aircraft in about 10 minutes. The rescue pilot's response was immediate and decisive. Hawkeye 7-7, we copy enemy contact. Apache gunships are moving to intercept. Stay hidden and do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Chen watched through her binoculars as the enemy convoy reached her crashed A-10. The fighters dismounted from their vehicles and began searching the aircraft and the surrounding area. She could see them examining the cockpit and walking around the landing site, obviously looking for any sign of the pilot who had been flying the aircraft. The Taliban fighters were thorough in their search, spreading out across the riverbed and examining every possible hiding place near the crash site. Chen held her breath as several of the enemy fighters moved up the slope in her direction, but they stopped their search about halfway to her position, apparently deciding that she had not been able to travel that far from the aircraft. After about 20 minutes, the enemy fighters seemed to reach the conclusion that the pilot had either been killed in the crash or had somehow escaped the immediate area. They began setting up what appeared to be an ambush position around the aircraft, obviously hoping to capture or kill any rescue forces that might arrive to search for the pilot. Chen's radio crackled again with an update from the rescue team. Hawkeye 7-7, Pedro 2-4. Apache gunships are in position and have visual on the enemy forces. We are going to clear the landing zone before attempting pickup. Stay down and stay hidden. The attack came without warning. Chen watched in fascination as 2 Apache helicopters materialized from behind the southern ridge, their weapons already locked onto the enemy positions around her crashed aircraft. The 30-millimeter chain guns opened fire almost simultaneously, sending streams of high-explosive rounds into the Taliban positions with devastating effect. The enemy fighters who survived the initial attack scattered toward their vehicles, but the Apache crews were relentless in their pursuit. Hellfire missiles streaked down from the helicopters, destroying 2 of the pickup trucks and eliminating any organized resistance from the Taliban force. Within 5 minutes, the brief but intense battle was over. The valley was quiet again except for the sound of the Apache helicopters circling overhead, their crews scanning for any remaining threats. Chen could see smoke rising from the destroyed vehicles and debris scattered across the riverbed, where the enemy ambush had been positioned. Her radio came to life again with the voice of the rescue pilot. Hawkeye 77, Pedro 24. Landing zone is secure. Pop smoke and we'll come get you. Chen activated her smoke signal and watched as the orange smoke drifted up from her position on the slope. Within minutes, she could hear the distinctive sound of the rescue helicopter approaching from the south, its crew ready to bring her home after one of the most harrowing days of her military career. 3 weeks after her rescue from the Afghan mountains, Major Sarah Chen stood in the briefing room at Bagram Airfield, facing a room full of pilots who had come to hear her presentation on low-level tactics in complex terrain. The audience included not only Air Force pilots but also representatives from the Navy, Marines, and Army aviation units, all eager to learn from her unprecedented success in the Devil's Throat Canyon. Commander Jake Morrison sat in the front row, his weathered face showing a respect that had been entirely absent during their first meeting. The SEAL team leader had specifically requested permission to attend Chen's briefing, and he had brought with him the 7 other members of his team who had been trapped in the canyon that day. Chen clicked to her first slide, which showed a satellite image of the canyon where the rescue had taken place. The narrow valley looked even more forbidding from above, its rocky walls and confined spaces appearing almost impossible to navigate with an aircraft. Several pilots in the audience shook their heads as they studied the terrain, finally understanding the full scope of what she had accomplished. The key to success in terrain like this, Chen began, her voice confident and clear, is abandoning traditional approach doctrine and thinking three-dimensionally about the problem. Every canyon has multiple approach vectors that become viable if you're willing to accept non-standard flight profiles. She clicked to the next slide, which showed her unusual inverted approach path along the western wall of the canyon. The flight path looked more like the track of a roller coaster than a military attack run, threading between rocky outcroppings and requiring constant altitude changes to maintain the proper attack geometry. The inverted approach allowed me to use the canyon wall as cover, while maintaining the angle of attack necessary for effective gun runs, Chen continued. It's not a maneuver you'll find in any tactical manual, but it was the only way to get the job done in that particular situation. A Marine Corps pilot raised his hand with a question that Chen had been expecting. Major, what about the safety considerations? That approach profile seems to violate every risk management protocol we use for close air support. Chen nodded, acknowledging the legitimate concern. You're absolutely right that it was high-risk flying. But the SEALs on the ground were facing certain death if we couldn't provide effective support. Sometimes the calculation comes down to accepting high risk to prevent certain disaster. Commander Morrison stood up from his seat in the front row, and the room fell silent as he prepared to speak. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in combat operations, and his words commanded the attention of everyone present. I want everyone in this room to understand something, Morrison said, his eyes moving across the assembled pilots. My team had been written off. 3 different attack aircraft had attempted to provide support, and all 3 had been forced to abort their runs due to the terrain. We were running low on ammunition, and we all knew that we probably weren't going home. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Major Chen didn't just save our lives that day. She did something that the best pilots in the military had declared impossible, and she did it in an aircraft that was taking damage with fuel running low, while maintaining the precision necessary to avoid hitting friendly forces. The SEAL commander turned to face Chen directly, his expression serious but respectful. Before that mission, I had my doubts about whether any pilot could handle the complexity of that situation. I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it. Major Chen proved that sometimes it's not about the pilot's gender or background. It's about skill, courage, and the willingness to think outside the box when lives are on the line. The room erupted in applause, but Chen remained focused on the larger implications of what had happened. The mission had been successful, but it had also demonstrated that conventional tactics weren't always sufficient for the complex battlefield, environments that American forces were likely to face in the future. Over the following months, Chen's tactics were incorporated into the curriculum at the Air Force's weapons school, and she was invited to brief senior leaders throughout the military on the lessons learned from the Devil's Throat mission. Her approach to low-level flying in complex terrain became the foundation for new tactical doctrines that would save lives in future conflicts. The formal recognition came 6 months later, when Chen was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the rescue mission. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, with her parents in attendance, along with Commander Morrison and his entire SEAL team. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During a visit to Nellis Air Force Base, Chen was approached by a young female pilot who was just beginning her training in the A-10 Warthog. The pilot's eyes were bright with enthusiasm as she introduced herself. "Major Chen, I wanted to thank you," the young pilot said, her voice carrying the same determination that Chen remembered feeling during her own early days in military aviation. "When I was growing up, people told me that girls couldn't fly fighters. When I entered pilot training, they said women weren't strong enough for close air support missions. But after hearing about what you did in Afghanistan, I knew that all those people were wrong." Chen smiled as she looked at the young pilot, seeing in her the same passion and determination that had driven her own career. The mission in the Devil's Throat had been about saving the lives of 8 trapped SEALs, but its impact had extended far beyond that single day in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had proven that sometimes the impossible just required a different perspective, and that the most important qualifications for success weren't found in traditional expectations, but in the courage to attempt what others believed couldn't be done. The young pilots who would follow in her footsteps would face their own impossible missions, but they would do so knowing that the word impossible was often just another way of saying not yet attempted. Major Sarah Chen had shattered more than just the SEALs' doubts that day in the canyon. She had broken through barriers that had existed for decades, proving once and for all that excellence in military aviation was measured not by gender or background, but by skill, determination, and the willingness to risk everything when American lives hung in the balance.